Pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Anne Benjamin. Anne has really got a stellar career in education over the years. She directed and wrote probably one of the first, or the first, religious education program for primary schools following the old Red Catechism. She worked at Australian Catholic University in teaching religious education. She worked as assistant director and then director of the Parramatta CEO, and during that time she moved into the whole area of leadership training as such. Following her resignation, or her retirement rather, from Parramatta, she has continued to be working as education consultant in a number of places. In fact, my conversations with her over the last couple of weeks included her mention that she was just back from Tonga and she was heading off up to Port Macquarie to do some work as well. So we really have somebody who's been involved in the church and in education for many, many years. So to launch the book tonight, would you please welcome Dr. Anne Benjamin.
Thank you, Gary. Can you hear me down the back? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I'll shout. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see some old friends and new here this evening, and this is indeed an important book. One of the difficulties I had, my version is the unedited proof, when I was reading Kevin's book for the first time, is I kept wanting to talk back to it. And in his absence, I wanted to have a few arguments or discussions or go a little bit further on some points. Tonight I'm going to be very disciplined and stick to the book itself and try and keep my ideas and my thoughts out of it as much as possible. When Gary Eastman asked me to launch Kevin Pickle's book, I realised that in agreeing to do so, it would require me to engage once again with the very fraught, humbling and horrifying fact of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. A church which has been my life, as it has, I imagine, for most people in this room, and one which I've been professionally associated with for 50 years. You might think that's exaggerating and it only is 10, but it is 50. When he asked me, I thought, now I've heard the name Kevin Peoples, who is this guy? How would he deal with this sensitive topic? Would he discriminate between the abusers and the many good men and women of the church who are appalled and indirectly, I think, contaminated by association? Of course, I knew that if Garrett were publishing the book, it would have to be a good book. So that's a little promotion, Gary. Just a few pages in, Kevin makes it very clear that he's not blindly lashing out at the past or the future. He clearly acknowledges that the vast majority of priests in Australia are good men. My only sadness is that he couldn't say that they are good men and good women, and that the statistics support this. Although the statistics themselves, as we know from the Royal Commission, are sobering. And he also acknowledges the impact upon all faithful Catholics. My other apprehension, which I mentioned in a phone call to Kevin, was that the subject matter might cut too close to me at a personal level. My brother attended the seminary in Springwood for a short time, as many people in this room did. My brother was there a few years ahead of Kevin. It is one of my regrets I failed to clarify with him before his death whether his untimely coming home from Springwood was due to the fact that he was totally hopeless at Latin or that he was found smoking in the dairy. I don't know. I know the place, Springwood, I know the grotto, the bushwalks, the football field. Later on, my brother went to Victoria and studied in Glen Waverley, Werribee in Glen Waverley, and was a classmate of George Pell. So that was a matter of some sensitivity for me in taking on this task tonight. Many of these named in the book are friends and people who've been part of my life. And then in the 1990s, St Columba's itself came back into my life in its new identity as a diocesan Catholic school. I became quite relaxed, though, in reading the book. Trapped in a Closed World is a reflection on 3 years in the author's life made from the perspective of 50 or so years. If Trapped began life as a memoir, it became something much more. As Kevin's recall of life as a seminarian in the mid-1960s bumped into international research about clerical sexual abuse and the recent Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses, memoir, in fact, became a doorway into a larger discussion about the contemporary church. And as Gary has indicated, that is part of the book's strength. The discussion is outspoken. In Kevin's words, the culture of the church is a significant factor when evaluating, firstly, the failed response by the church hierarchy to sexual abuse within the church, and secondly, the causes of sexual abuse by Catholic priests. Central to his argument is that the seminary system formed both the priests who sexually abused and the bishops who tried to avoid scandal and protect the church through silence and inaction. While I think he's being both respectful and balanced, his message in the book is clear. The old constructs for envisioning ministry, and so for preparing for ministry, were worse than inadequate. The current crisis in the Catholic Church, he adds, could have been predicted. The sexual abuse scandal is a symptom of a much deeper malaise. The creation of a caste of young, sexually immature men trained in isolated, misogynist communities to live apart with a sense of moral superiority over all other men and women. I need to add that Kevin acknowledges that his experience of seminary is not necessarily that of others. And at one point in the book, he reflects on the apparent differences between Springwood and the Jesuit-led Corpus Christi Seminary in Victoria. Nonetheless, there are echoes of Bishop Jeff Robinson's recent writing in Kevin People's Association of Abuse and Moral Elitism and its associated distortion of power. Again, another aside, maybe I'm hoping that if I get another book out, I might get it published by Garrett, but I do congratulate you, Gary, for making Jeff Robinson's books available, because some of them and a personal aside, so unfairly received by some. At 27 to 29 years old, Kevin was older than many other students at Springwood in 1964 to 1966. Now, I'm the mother of a few kids in that, young adults in that age group. And I suspect they wouldn't understand the title of this book, because they come from a culture that knows what they want and know how to go about doing it. I suspect they simply couldn't comprehend why a young man of their age would feel trapped, a Mr. In-Between, as Kevin describes himself, belonging neither to the seminary nor to his life back home. And I think another of the values of Kevin's book is its delineation, not just for those of us who are mature, but also for younger people, of the risks of a closed culture. In Trapped, Kevin draws on his historian's perspective of the papacy and individual popes with what I came to see as a trademark bluntness. He cites more contemporary sources, including Mr. Geraghty's and the Australian Royal Commission, US and Irish Studies, and applies his analysis to them, which is useful in its own right. Referring to his 3 years as a seminarian, Kevin writes gratefully of some people, admiring of some, and brutally frankly about others. He gives credit to good teachers, to kindly professors, and to doors that open for him. But he does not hold back in being critical of poor teaching and teachers and of stupid bureaucracy. And for that I say, hear, hear. Not surprisingly, he comments on celibacy. Of itself, he insists celibacy is not problematic, but it is problematic when packaged with a psychosocial immaturity, overvaluing of conformity, a sense of entitlement, immunity from criticism, and the arrogance of absolute certitude, which is what Kevin describes as his seminary experience in the mid-1960s. That and misogyny. Misogyny and Catholicism are synonymous, he declares. He rarely leaves the reader in doubt about what he means. So if you thought you were going to sort of have to read between the lines, you won't have to bother. He describes seminarians as pampered little petals. I couldn't think of no. Who depended on women for all their personal care. He relates a curious story, a bizarre story, about his abortive attempt to hang feminising curtains in his rooms. And he gives examples where women provoked scandal simply by being in the seminary building. That reminded me, on a personal note, of a time when I was invited by Bede Heather, of whom Kevin writes with great respect and affection. Bede invited me to use the Manly Seminary Library for some research back in 1971. And it was very clear to me that Bede was completely embarrassed by the lack of welcome that was extended to me. But he, of course, made up for it with his characteristic graciousness and hospitality. Back to Kevin. We were instructed, not educated, he writes, and groomed to be gentlemen with a smattering of knowledge as thin as the butter we spread on our stale bread, with our lives ground out of a stone called routine. Nice writing. Throughout, he reflects on his in-out approach to being in the seminary, feeling he should try it out, although finding dissonance in much of the seminary way of life. This is his voice. The raw physicality of the Australian bush that surrounds us is at odds with our world of magic and mystery that the men at the Council of Trent concocted for us in the middle of the 16th century. He writes in such a way, this is a little aside, that's always educating those of us who might know less than himself and other people, which is helpful. Back to Kevin. We are being protected from the same world that we are called to save. God help us. In our febrile atmosphere, the danger of neuroticism is real for even the sanest. The contradictions Kevin encountered in Springwood ran deep. He reminisces, from the time I was a small boy, I enjoyed being in church at night. The timber arch, the smell and cloud of incense, the warmth of it all with loved ones. And then he comes back to the seminary. Love and freedom threaten the essence of this place. Love and freedom threaten the essence of this place. He describes the utter loneliness of being in an environment where God is ineffable, cold, distant, masculine, aloof and silent. Kevin's prose, as you might have gathered, flows with poetry and clarity. And I will read another paragraph where he has been reflecting on the harsh seminary God. The bush surrounds us like an old, old man, wizened and drawn. When I can, I join company with this old man along one of these red gravel roads, but not looking for ancient signs like Eugene Stockton. I look for different, more recent signs. Clinging to the trees are the abandoned shells of cicadas, On the red ground, black ants scurry in frantic busyness. If I walk far enough, I can hear farm noises. I hear a man shout away in the distance and a dog barking. There is another world, and I am comforted. Kevin Peoples is a lover of history and of literature, and he has brought both to his reflection on an institution which is dear to him. He does so in a way which informs with idiosyncratic flair. Towards the end of the book, he reclaims his God with a hymn to her in her pink dressing gown, her green cardigan, and her blue overalls. It is a lovely hymn to a sweet, warm God who loves the world. His book ultimately challenges the Church to walk forward into the future more humbly, less institutionalised, more simply and humanely, seeking the reign of God rather than the dominance of the institution. When we visited him in Springwood in the late 1950s, my brother proudly pointed out the new block at the back of the existing buildings that Kevin also refers to. Some of you here will be aware of the new brick block. As director of schools in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the old stone walls of St Columba's rattled with the clatter of lots of girls and boys, and mostly good teachers, I discovered that the same new block was unusable, unsafe, and prohibitively costly to rectify. It is a fitting image for the story Kevin has told in Trapped. I'm delighted to launch Kevin Peoples' Trapped in a Closed World.